we're done. This concept of batch size and batch size reduction. I build test equipment.
Yep.
We come from a background where we would need to design everything before we could test anything, and we've learned that's not the best way to go. But can you give a kind of a basic primer to our audience about the mindset about looking at an overall design project, and whether you want to look at it as one single design or remove it into smaller designs? Because this is an area where a lot of what you've got in flow starts to mimic some things that you also see in more of an agile mindset. And I'd kind of like to dig into that a little bit.
Agile is pretty much automatically working in small batch sizes because they work in sprints. Although they never use the term batch size, which is a great loss, because for 100 years we've worried about batch size in manufacturing, and they've lost access to all of that thinking. But I'll give you a classic. For me, the batch size in an engineering process is at a deeper level is the quantity of information or material that changes state in a particular instant in time.
Okay.
And to bring that down to something more practical. So let's say you have to do system test on your system. And you say, well, the only way I have fidelity in my system test is if I test the entire system. So you say, by definition, I can only do system test when the entire system is designed. And that's that is maximum theoretical batch size. You couldn't make batch size higher than 100% of the system. And then what you might do, though, is you might look at that and you say, did we really need to have the full system available for everything that we learned in system test? And so I've worked with organizations where they made a list of every single defect that showed up when they ran system test on their design. And they set a bunch of engineers in the room, and they went item by item through that list and said, did we need to have the entire system available to have found this defect? And a second question, or is there a way we could modify our upstream processes to have extracted that information earlier upstream? And and in fact, they would say the answer would be, in some cases, the answer is somewhat complicated, because they say, look, when you do system test, the system is its own test bed. You don't have to invest in any infrastructure. It tests itself. If we're going to test pieces of the system upstream, we're going to have to invest in testing infrastructure, things like that. But the interesting thing that you discover, and in general, there's been a huge tendency to push testing further and further upstream, is, you get it off the critical path and things. You have less of an explosion when you do the integration at the end of the process. You actually correct problems where you have enough time to test whether the fix actually works, which is a big problem when you're discovering it in downstream.
Rework expense is dramatically lower.
And the other interesting thing you find is when you end up creating this infrastructure for testing at the subsystem level, you're accessing the components in a way that you can often massively increase the speed at which you do testing. Because a lot of times at a system level, events occur relatively infrequently, and you need to accumulate a lot of hours before you induce that effect. And if it's an intermittent effect, it's even harder for you. What I've seen is some people who used to be testing at the system level who move to subsystem level testing, where they basically can break at the interface to a particular subsystem and things like that. They can exercise that subsystem like 10,000 times faster than they can produce the defects when they're testing at a system level. they get these huge increases. Every once in a while, the protocol drops a byte and it crashes the entire system and things like that. Well, yeah, that event occurs once every 100 hours and things when I do it at the system level. But if I rig my test bed
can make
at the
it happen every
subsystem
time.
level, I can make it occur every 10 milliseconds. And then I can find out what's really going on. So, I mean, there are really interesting dividends that come from saying, let's question that assumption that the high fidelity answer is really necessary for everything that we learn from system test. We're never going to put system test out of business. We're still going to need that. But what we'd like to be is in a world where we find 3% of the system level problems when we hit system test instead of 90%.
Yeah, it's certainly the most expensive place to find them at the end in system tests, for sure.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of meat, and I can tell you, and my staff can attend to too, that's still the pregame warm-up to what you have in Flow. When I read through the book, by the way, for those of you guys who don't know, Flow is Don's most recent book, but it's been out for a few years. We talked about this before the show. If you and I have the chance to get together again in 3 years, this is a loaded question. Where do you think the innovation from what you've done in Flow will be in terms of continuing to innovate to be better as a product development organization? And the hidden question in that is where would you go in your next book?
Well, I'm probably, where I'd go in my next book is different than where this book would be.
Oh, fascinating. Tell me.
Because where I go in my next book,
Yeah.
it's a book that I've wanted to write, but I never get excited about writing it, is I need to produce a 150-page version of the Principles of Flow that is an easy read.
The Cliff Notes of Flow.
Because what's happening is I got VPs of engineering who are going to the VP of marketing saying, you need to read this book, and it's not going to happen. And so then they have to explain the entire book on a whiteboard to someone. And so what I really need to do is produce a tool that saves people who have read the book from having to explain the book to someone who's
Does that
not
resonate
gonna
with
read it.
anybody here? Yeah.
And so I need to do that. It's not an exciting project to me because it doesn't break new ground, but I know there's a need for it, and I hope, we were talking a little earlier, maybe this coronavirus thing
Oh, yeah, it's affording you some time.
will create time that I can sort of fill that need.
Well, I would love to volunteer our staff as your beta
Guinea
prototype.
pigs? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because we understand what you just explained very well.
Yeah.
So-
There are two people, some people say, oh, read Managing the Design Factory first because then you'll understand
That's
how
what I did.
Reinertsen thinks, and then you can read Flow. Dean Leffingwell of SAFE fame says, read the book once, don't try to understand anything, and then read it a second time and try to understand everything. And it's not as glib and silly as it sounds, because if you skim through the book, you see more of the structure of what the overall engine looks like, what the major subsystems are, and how they interact. And it's much easier to actually read the book the second time because everything has been foreshadowed. Issues of batch size have been foreshadowed, issues of queue size, issues of cadence, and things like that. You end up understanding the elements of the system a lot better.
Yeah, I
It's
would
not
say,
like if somebody was trying to explain how a car engine works to you, and they just gave you a little soda straw to look at, and they guided the soda straw around the
Right.
different subsystems and things like that.
I can
That's
tell you
hard.
sincerely, in our organization, it's more of a third way to read that book, which is read 1 or 2 chapters and then ponder what that impact is on your organization for 2 to 3 months before you go on.
Yeah, actually, one approach that has been highly successful for people is they use a book club approach where they
Right.
say, 1 chapter a week, try to read as much of the chapter as you can, assign one person to make sure that you have at least one person who's read the whole chapter, and then they sit down and they discuss where's the low-hanging fruit for our organization.
Right.
And it gets them through just on a weekly cadence. They get through the chapters. It doesn't become an overwhelming burden to everyone. And they start developing an organizational consensus on where the opportunity is.
So obviously, your book, I can't tell you how many copies of this I've bought, but you can get this on Amazon, right?
Yep.
How else can people learn about you, get in contact with you, utilize your services?
I have a website. There's a bunch of YouTube and InfoQ videos from things I've talked about in conferences and stuff like that. I appear at conferences from time to time. The book is probably the most common
The best
entry
way to
point
do
for
it.
people.
Yeah, well, I couldn't recommend this enough, and I know for our audience and people around there, coming into this episode, I had a number of people reach out wanting to join in a live stream and come join us in the audience, and so I think you're more popular than maybe a lot of people realized, and I can't thank you enough for coming. You have made a huge impact on our organization, and look forward to working with you in the future.
It's more of a cult book than
Well, we're happy to have you as our cult leader. Don, great to have you.